Oren Cass, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Um, you know, One of the strange themes of the last 10 years is the search of Trumpism for intellectual coherence. And you're certainly not somebody who is trying to do that exactly. I'm sure you have your criticisms, some private and some public, of the president. But there's somebody who's trying to create the preconditions for a kind of multiracial working class conservatism, for a conservative movement that takes seriously the economic plights of working people in the United States and breaks with some of the economic presuppositions that drove the party, certainly from the days of Ronald Reagan, until let's say the 2010s. That is you. What do you think the traditional Republican Party got wrong on economic policy, and how does it need to change in order to meet this moment, both substantively and electorally?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the that's exactly the right question. What happened on the right of center, and I think you're right about the focus on the Reagan era, because one thing I always find interesting in these debates is people have a very strange understanding of even what conservatism is or should say about economics. At this point, we think it is tax cuts, free trade, deregulation, maybe some light union busting. But all of those things as an agenda are a relatively recent phenomenon. And what I think you saw happen with the Reagan coalition that was formed was this effort to really bring libertarians in and frankly move to an economics that is what I would call market fundamentalism. That puts excess faith in markets to essentially always deliver the best possible outcome. And then that defines that outcome almost entirely in terms of consumer welfare. So we embraced this quite formal economic model that said, the goal of economics, the goal of markets is to let people consume as much as possible. And by the way, the less work you have to do in order to consume, the better. And the way that we're going to get that is to just get government out of the way and let markets let markets rip, because markets always accomplish that. And first of all, again, neither of those things is conservative, but more importantly, neither of those things is right. And so the focus of our work is on challenging both those elements, recognizing the limits of markets, recognizing the role that public policy does need to play, but then also recognizing that what we actually want markets to do and what we want from our economy is much broader than just cheap stuff. It is an economic system that actually supports family and community flourishing, supports a strong nation, and that again, that's not something markets are necessarily going to deliver in all cases.
Um, so, Steelman, for me, why it is that the basic economic policies of the last decades have gone wrong. Of course, there was the Great Recession, which was, um, uh, a very significant shortcoming. But we've sort of moved out of the Great Recession pretty strongly. When you survey the last 30 or 40 years of the American economy, it's sort of a remarkable success story compared to other countries. It's remarkable, for example, that even in the age of very rapid economic growth in China and to a lesser degree India and so on, America has basically held on to its global share of GDP over that period of time. When I first came to the United States in the mid 2000s, I was very struck by how affluent America is and how comfortable the lives of average Americans are compared to those in Europe. But at the time, America and Europe still had roughly comparable GDP per capita. Now the GDP per capita of the United States is double that of many countries in Europe. And in the last years, after a long period of stagnation of living standards for people at the lower end of sort of the skill distribution and the wage distribution, wage growth has actually been fastest for those at the lower end of the economic spectrum. Why is it that we shouldn't think of the American economy as a remarkable success over the last 30 or 40 years? And why is it therefore that we need a sort of radical shift of paradigm?
Well, I think in part you had the answer within the question there, which was the acknowledgement that for most of that period that you were just describing as an extraordinary success, we actually saw a great deal of stagnation. I would say for the median, certainly in the lower half of the income distribution. And so, one thing I would say is that GDP per capita is a doubly failed measure. GDP is not the right measure of even material prosperity, let alone sort of more broadly human flourishing. And per capita, as just a raw average, tells you in a lot of cases very little about how the median and especially how those who are struggling are actually doing in a society. So I think if you actually look at what has happened in the U.S. economy, it's absolutely the case that material living standards have improved across the board. Even if you're talking about very low income households, if you want to know how big their TVs are, whether they have air conditioning, even their access to health care, there's no question that it has gotten much better. But I think that is a very partial and incomplete measure of what we're actually looking for in a society. The reality is that in part to accomplish that, we had to rely on much higher levels of redistribution, which again can solve the consumption problem, but brings a lot of dysfunction and maladies in its own right. And I would say that what we have generally speaking really undermined is the capacity of the typical American, who again is someone who still doesn't even earn a college degree, certainly doesn't have a job that we would think of as requiring a college degree, ensuring that that's somebody who can, based on their own interests and aptitudes in the community where they grew up or want to live, are actually in a position to start and raise a family and achieve anything we would consider to be middle class security. And that's what is missing and what a GDP per capita measure doesn't even begin to get at. I think a very telling indicator that is helpful to focus on is what has gone on with the opioid epidemic. Obviously the sheer number of deaths from the opioid epidemic are an extraordinary tragedy. But what I find to be the most shocking measure is to just look at what it has meant for the death rate from drug abuse in this country, as compared to what was going on with alcohol abuse in post-Soviet Russia. I mean, we think of that decade, the 1990s in Russia, and the sort of stereotype of community and national collapse as sort of the epitome of what can go wrong in a sense. Our death rate from drugs in this country is now as high as it was in Russia from alcohol in the 1990s. And so that both speaks to the specifics of the deaths, but it speaks to a much deeper social dysfunction that, yes, persists alongside much larger televisions, but I think speaks to a real failure of our economic model and its ability to support the things we really care about. And then the last thing I would just say that then kind of becomes a much longer discussion is what has happened to the actual sort of macro health of the economy. What we are seeing is declining levels of investment, slowing productivity growth, deindustrialization. And so I think the trajectory of the American economy is actually a very concerning one at that macro level of sort of national strength and ability to drive the kind of economic progress we really want to see.
So you make a very convincing case, and I'm sympathetic to much of it, but just to sort of push you and really get into the details of this debate, two possible responses, right? The first is to say that the rise of the opioid epidemic in particular and the deaths of despair that Angus Deaton has written about more broadly, Angus Deaton and Anne Case, who's been on the podcast, have written about more broadly, is clearly a very serious problem. The question is whether that really has economic rather than cultural roots. So some of the criticisms of that line of work have been to say that many of the same economic developments have been present in other countries in Western Europe and elsewhere, but they haven't seen a similar rise in deaths of despair, and they haven't seen a similar rise, particularly in deaths from drugs. So there's questions about whether that is rooted in the fundamental American economic settlement, whether it's to do with regulatory failures around opioids and the specific attributes of the American healthcare system, which of course bound up with broader economic questions, but maybe more specific than that. More broadly, there's a question about how central manufacturing should be to the future of the American economy. Clearly, what we've seen is a major disruption in which manufacturing has moved out from many parts of the United States, leaving a dearth of good jobs for people who are trained to be factory workers, trained to contribute to the economy in that kind of way. And I think that there is a generally tragic generation that should have been helped by economic policy and wasn't. People who should have been compensated for the gains that other people had from globalization in ways that economic theory predicts and never were. But as that generation is nearing retirement age, there's a question about, in order to have good jobs for people who are not going to go to college, who are not going to be computer programmers, and we're seeing that perhaps there's a limited demand even for those, we need to go back to building stuff in America, to having factories. But if the trends of the last few years are showing rapid wage gains for people at the lower end of the educational spectrum, then the response might be, no, we've actually gotten through the transition, right? We now are at a point where a younger generation has lots of people who are trained for the jobs that are actually needed across the economy, and they're able to make better wages because we have a tight labor market. And so perhaps going back to trying to push them into manufacturing is sort of too late. At this point, we've made the transition to an economy that is more focused on services, in which actually there's increasingly high-quality jobs in the service economy, even for people at the lower end of the income distribution. And trying at this point to sort of make factories reappear is both going against the direction of travel in history and against what's actually going to effectively create those high-quality jobs for lower-income Americans. I'm not sure that I'm convinced by all of these critiques, but I'd love to hear your response to them.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a good rundown of the argument. I think, briefly on the question about the sort of cultural versus economic determinants of a lot of the dysfunction and tragedy that we are seeing in this country, I think surely the answer is both. I don't think anybody would argue this is a purely economic phenomenon. My frustration is that there do seem to be a lot of people who are trying to argue it is purely a cultural phenomenon. And the reality, the clear tell here is that all of these things are only afflicting one part of the society, specifically the part that has seen the economic challenges, right? And so it is a very difficult case to make, I think, to say that, now obviously we don't just have a single national culture, we have all sorts of distinctions therein. But at the end of the day, it is specifically those parts of the country, those people of particular socioeconomic classes and so forth, who are facing the downside of our economic system, who are experiencing all of these problems. And so I think there's a very heavy burden of proof that no one has come close to carrying to claim that it is not an economic phenomenon that we're observing. On the macro question about manufacturing in particular, I guess there are a few things to say. One is, this isn't just about the jobs in manufacturing itself. I think what we are seeing in the U.S. economy today is sort of a fundamental disorder that is a function of saying that manufacturing just doesn't matter, right? That we don't need to make anything. that, we can all have, our iPhones can all say designed in California, and it doesn't matter where they're actually produced. And the reality is that the manufacturing sector, and I really, and I would define it a little bit more broadly, really, as the industrial sector, energy production, natural resources, essentially doing things in the physical economy, really matter to the ultimate health of your services-based economy, right? There's no question that over time we are evolving and will continue to evolve more toward a services-based economy. But you do need to actually build that on a foundation of industrial strength, I would say, for a few reasons. One is, the actual ability to make things turns out to be incredibly important to driving innovation. And this is a point that Andy Grove, the legendary CEO of Intel, back when Intel was a great company, used to make especially well as he watched manufacturing get outsourced out of Silicon Valley. He said, look, engineers solving the narrow problem of efficiency in their firms are absolutely doing the rational thing here. But in the long run, if you want to lead on innovation and technology and on all the services built on top of those things, you do actually need to have the engineering as well. That a huge share of innovation does come on the shop floor. And so even just as a modern tech services economy, you should care about it. I think another reason to really care about it is from a sort of perspective of diversification and diffusion in the economy. There are some industries that are very well geared toward, concentrating in coastal urban cities, finance, tech, media. There are others that really benefit from being in places that are close to natural resources, that have logistical advantages, that have a lot of open space. And so you actually want to have a diversified economy that does that other stuff too. And so manufacturing industry really anchor the economies of large parts of the country in ways that then allow for all of those services jobs, right? It is great that a barber, particularly a barber in a city can now earn, I don't know, $40, $50 an hour. That barber is not actually more productive than a barber 400 years ago in terms of how long it takes to cut somebody's hair. In fact, it probably takes him longer. What makes that a good job now is that you are cutting the hair of very productive people. And so even if we are moving to a world where, something else people point out is factories will have fewer people working in them than they used to because they're highly automated. That's great. If the factory on the edge of town employs fewer highly paid, highly skilled workers, that is still an anchor for a flourishing local services-based economy. If you say we just don't care about the factory, shut it down and move it to China, I guarantee you the experience of that community is going to be very, very different. And so I think there are a lot of reasons, again, just thinking holistically about what a healthy economy looks like, that it is important to recognize that not all GDP is created equal, and industrial GDP does have particular value. The last 2 points I would just add on it, one is, even under the best theories of free trade and so forth, there were supposed to be a lot of things other people would make for us. There were also supposed to be things we were going to make for other people. And what's gone wrong is not that some things moved, it's that things moved and nothing else came. And that we lost our leadership in advanced technology also. We lost our leadership in semiconductors. We've lost our leadership in aerospace. And that is what tells you this isn't just trade working the way economists said it would. It's a much deeper problem. And then the last point is that this connects to is that there are also concerns beyond the economic here. That from a resilience perspective, from a national security perspective, you actually have to make things. And, we talk a lot about this concept of a defense industrial base. And one thing we're doing a lot of work on right now at American Compass is just emphasizing, throw the word defense out of that. It is nonsensical to think you could maintain a strong defense industrial base absent an actual strong industrial base. And so if you actually want to be a world power and be able to defend yourself, you have to have a commitment to maintaining a healthy industrial economy, even if it is not, quote, the most productive allocation of capital in every case. But generally speaking, I would say it is a much more productive allocation of capital than a lot of things we are allocating capital to right now.
So let's assume that my listeners are convinced by everything you've said so far, that we shouldn't make GDP the be-all and end-all of our economic policy, that we recognize that manufacturing is an important part of a healthy 21st century economy. Doesn't have to be the major part or the dominant part, but it has to be a healthy part of it. And we're currently falling far below that in the United States and probably in big parts of Western Europe as well. How do we change that? What does an economic policy look like that builds on the importance of economic growth, on the importance of market competition, but redirects our economic energies in order to better the lives of ordinary working people and make sure that we maintain a healthy industrial base for reasons economic and otherwise in the United States?
Well, I think there's both an outward-looking element and an inward-looking element. The outward-looking element that is obviously getting a lot of attention here early in the Trump administration is the idea of tariffs. And the idea that you actually want to have policies that give an advantage to domestic production over imports. And this drives economists crazy, but it's important to understand that the reason it drives them crazy is because they are working from a set of assumptions and a set of models that says that making things doesn't matter, right? This is the same set of models that said free trade with China is a brilliant idea, that in fact tell them that free trade with China was a brilliant idea and has worked out great. And so unsurprisingly, when you say, well, actually, we would like to do something different, they say, what are you talking about? You're crazy. If you actually recognize that making things matters, that we would love to have high levels of trade, but it needs to be balanced trade. It needs to be things coming into the country traded for things going back out. Then in fact, having a tariff and putting a thumb on the scale for domestic production isn't some inefficiency driven into the system. It's actually it is a correction of an inefficiency that we're suffering from, and can lead to better outcomes. And so having a tariff that says, look, you can import stuff if you have to or if you want to, but there's going to be a cost associated with doing that, which means you're going to think a lot harder about what can you make here. What can you buy that is made here? And if you're investing, maybe it makes sense to invest in building things here. I think is incredibly important.
Let's go back to basics on this one, because obviously tariffs are a really big part of the debate, and I feel like a bunch of people who've taken who've never taken economics course, and worse, a bunch of people who've only ever taken economics 101, try to make sense of what's going on and often fail. And I, of course, am not an economist, so I'm going to play dumb here with some rooting in my actual state of knowledge. As most listeners will know, the traditional stance of classical economics about this is the theory of comparative advantage, that country A is going to be better at producing some kinds of goods, let's say good A, than at producing good B. Country X is going to be better at producing some kinds of good, let's call it good A. Country Y is going to be better at producing other kinds of goods.
Right. Well, actually, just to interrupt briefly, I think in talking about it, let's just be much more concrete. I mean, let's use David Ricardo's example. Scotland is better at producing wool, and Portugal is better at producing wine, and go from there.
Perfect. Amazing. And so, Scotland has a need for both wool and wine, and Portugal has a need for both wool and wine. And if we don't have trade between them, if there's very strong trade barriers, as there were for much of the 19th century and before, then Scotland is going to have to, spend a lot of resources to produce some pretty bad damn wine, and Portugal is going to do the same with wool. Now you open up trade between them, Scotland can produce a lot more wool. It can reallocate all of this wasted productive investment in wine, and it gets nice port. Imported from Portugal, and Portugal can stop wasting, trying to have sheep graze on, really hot territory where there isn't very much grass, and they can instead, rededicate those fields to wine, much better wine, much more ample wine, they both gain, right? And interestingly, that's true even if one country is better at producing both of those goods, as long as they're much better at one of its goods and only a little bit better at the other good, because then it makes sense to have trade as well, and that's how the math works out. All right, that's the theory. A lot of listeners will have listened to this and will know this. Now, there's a different kind of set of critiques you could make of that theory's application for today, and I want to understand which of those theories you think is central, and perhaps for you to spell all of those out better than I can, right? Like, so one theory is to say, well, that's true as long as there's no kind of distorting mechanisms. What's actually happening with China in particular, which is obviously one of the main concerns in this conversation, is that often they have stolen technology in ways that then benefited them. Or perhaps that they are putting all of these state subventions, all of those state subsidies into particular branches of industry, and so they end up exporting in all of those areas where we don't have a comparative advantage, and that's distorting international trade. That's a kind of, I think, important but limited concern about the particular nature of trade in this particular moment, right? A second one might be to say, well, look, okay, fine. So, Scotland is now no longer producing wine, but perhaps there's a lot of people who work in the wine industry in Scotland, and unless we compensate them, they're suddenly going to be out of a job. And even though we now can drink better and cheaper wine from Portugal, that's not worth a trade-off in terms of the kind of lives that are impacted here, in terms of a kind of transition costs. Perhaps it's not just a transition cost, right? Perhaps some Scots are really talented at building walls, but perhaps others have a skill set that's never going to be very useful for doing wool. And unless there's some wine industry in the country, we're always going to have this problem of 10% of the population being unemployed. Well, that seems like a big social problem, even if in purely GDP maximizing terms, the trade is going to be positive, right? A third, more fundamental critique is to say, well, it's nice to look at two countries with two goods, Scotland and Portugal, wine and wool. Well, we live in an incredibly complicated economy with 200 countries and hundreds of thousands of categories of goods, and perhaps this theory just doesn't scale to that level of complexity that nobody's ever quite managed to model because it's just too complicated. And it just turns out that there's a fundamental problem with this theory at that kind of level. Which of these kind of critiques do you think is most relevant here, or is your critique sort of different from the buckets I've just tried to come up with?
Well, I think the first bucket is probably the most important one. And I would frame it a little bit differently, but I think the key thing to recognize is that wine and wool model just bears no relationship to trade as it actually occurs in the modern world. And the problem isn't that, it's too complex now. I think it would kind of be an easy way out to say, like, oh, well, things are complex now, so it doesn't apply, right? You'd have to explain why it doesn't apply. And so I think it's really important to look at that wine and wool model and ask, well, what is going on today that is not like that? And there are two things in particular. One is the wine and wool model sounds very nice, but what happens if you change it to be semiconductor fabs and wool, right? All of the work done on basic sort of comparative advantage was done at a time when trade was occurring primarily in natural resources, agricultural goods, things that, first of all, were fairly comparable in their sort of economic implications for a country, and also things where countries really did have very significant advantages, right? As you just articulated, there are reasons Scotland should be focusing on wool and Portugal should be focusing on wine. But who should be focusing on semiconductor fabs? In an industrialized economy, when you're talking about manufactured goods, comparative advantage, for the most part, is not actually driving where production ends up getting located, right? The most advanced semiconductor manufacturing in the world is not happening in Taiwan because rocky outcroppings, just off the coast of authoritarian communist regimes is like the ideal place to build the world's most advanced semiconductor fabs. It's happening there because of government policy, first and foremost, that Taiwan used to say this is what we want here, while the United States said we don't really care whether we have it here. And so if you imagine a world of wool and semiconductors, you can see why Portugal, or I guess it would be Scotland, might say, well, actually, wait a minute, no, we're not happy just doing the wool while Portugal does the semiconductors. The trajectory of our economic growth actually requires us to be able to do semiconductors too. And that's something that comparative advantage just ignores. The second problem then, and it's very interesting because David Ricardo, literally mentions this in the next paragraph, that somehow the economists all decided to skip over, I guess. He notes that this model only applies in a world where capital is immobile, meaning that investors and capitalists in Scotland are going to stay in Scotland. And so they are going to decide, would they rather be doing wool or wine in Scotland? What he says is, if all the capital could just go to Portugal and you could do the wool and wine in Portugal because wages are much lower in Portugal, then that would happen. This would all break down. And he says the reason it's not going to happen is because people actively prefer to stay close to home and invest at home, and he hopes that that never changes. Well, guess what? It has changed.
So it's been a long time since I've read my Ricardo, but I had a suspicion that it somehow said England, and I just had a quick look while we were chatting on ChatGPT and Google, and I believe it is England and Portugal, not Scotland and Portugal, but the rest of your point stands.
Oh, that sounds right. Fair enough. The English, not that. We would hate to conflate the two. They get very upset.
We do not want to upset the
Never.
English or the Scottish in this example.
Indeed.
All right, perfect. Just on a side note, I think, and I'm going to have David Goodhart on the podcast soon to discuss this point. I think the idea that there's this huge class of knowers who really don't care about where they are and who are willing to move to Tokyo at the drop of a hat is wildly exaggerated. I think, by and large, people do have a strong link to their home country, but of course what's changed is that they can stay at home and invest in a different country. In order to invest in China, you don't have to move to China. Perhaps you have to go there sometimes on a business trip. If you're actively investing, if you're just investing in stocks, you don't even have to do that. But you can continue to live in New York City or in Paris or wherever you are while going to invest in those other places.
Yes.
So that's one of the changes that I think Ricardo would not have imagined.
Yes, that's right. I would say, though, to pursue the digression a bit further, what has changed is you have to not care that you're now dedicating your life to enriching people in China instead of in your own country. And so while the sort of technological ability allows you to stay in the United States, there is also a sort of disavowal of any national interest or solidarity that is part of the phenomenon as well. That I certainly think is troubling and not something a Smith or a Ricardo would have anticipated. But at the point where, okay, you can just move all the capital to China and make everything there, what happens is you're not actually trading thing for thing at all. And this is where the concept of a trade deficit comes in. It's really important to notice that Ricardo's model of comparative advantage has no trade deficit. John Stuart Mill, writing about this, actually specifically suggested, take the money out of it and really just think that you're trading something you made here for something made somewhere else, because that's how trade always works. When you get away from that, what you get is the world that we have now, where essentially, the $1 trillion trade deficit that we have represents now an enormous amount of stuff, much of which is stuff, in the past we would have made here, that is demanded by American consumers, but is made elsewhere and is not balanced by anything that we are making that others want. Right? One of the very funny things to ask people about the wonders of free trade is, oh, that's really interesting. What got offshored to America? You can find a couple of very limited things based on our cheap natural gas and so forth, but by and large, that's just a confusing question. Why, nothing got offshored to America. This was a one-way shift. And the results of that are doubly concerning. First of all, the implication of that trade deficit is we lost all of the manufacturing jobs in one area and created nothing new to offset it. And so to your question about, what about if there are some people who could make wine but can't do wool, we have a bigger problem, which is what about when there's no wine or wool going on? And so that's sort of an immediate problem for the health of our economy, for the trajectory of our growth. The second problem, of course, is that people are not sending us this stuff for free. What we are trading instead of goods is assets. And so what is going on, in fact, is $1 trillion of stuff is coming in, and what's going back out is pieces of paper that say IOU. A lot of it is outright treasury debt. It is literally pieces of paper saying the country will pay you for this someday. We don't know how. And then it's also assets. It is ownership of American companies. It is ownership of real estate. So we are essentially trading the future control of our economy and claim to its gains in return for consumption today. That has nothing to do with comparative advantage, and it is deeply, deeply unwise as a national economic policy. But again, there's nothing in economics or in sort of a theory of markets that's going to say, well, the market is going to fix this somehow. And so if we actually say look, the cheap stuff today is great, just like opening up all those credit card offers you get in the mail and maxing them all out, that might feel really great for a little while. It is also not an actually thoughtful strategy for the long run.
So I know that we're just on one of the strands of the kind of economic program you're interested in, but it's obviously one that is particularly relevant at the moment. How do we fix that? We're clearly in a very globalized economy. There's been a lot of very big benefits from that globalized economy, certainly to some of the countries that have had rapid economic growth and development and lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but also to our own country in terms of the goods and services that we've been able to use, and in terms of a rapid economic growth that's enabled. We don't want a collapse of the global economic system. We certainly don't want a chaotic and unmanaged collapse of a global economic system. At the same time, again, let's assume for sake of argument that somebody is convinced by what you're saying, that this is not a sustainable situation, that the trade of assets for temporary goods and services is not in fact one that we want to keep engaging in. How do we get out of this? How do we raise tariffs in a way that doesn't inspire a big global trade war? How are we able to use some of the genuine advantages of comparative advantage of trade that surely do persist even today, while addressing some of the ways in which this strategy is unwise?
Well, I just before we get to the sort of how do we do it, I do want to challenge the assertion that sort of globalization has brought all these wonderful gains as well to the United States. It's certainly true that for other countries, it has worked out exceptionally well. I don't think it's true that globalization has led to increased economic growth, for instance. In fact, economic growth in the U.S. has steadily slowed throughout the period that we have pursued globalization. It was much higher in periods when trade was much lower. And again, if you look at what globalization has actually done, how it has affected flows of investment, what industries have grown or not, it makes sense that this would not actually be good for economic growth in this country. I think likewise, it's worth scrutinizing even the idea that it has led to much cheaper stuff here. Because what we've done is after 30 years of just saying we don't care whether we can make anything, it now looks like, oh my gosh, look how incredibly cheap these Chinese televisions or whatever are. Imagine how much it would cost to make one here. And that's true as a static analysis at this moment in time. It's not at all true as a dynamic analysis in which we envision a world where we actually were focused on maintaining and extending our technical capabilities, our infrastructure, our expertise in manufacturing. We are already seeing this even just right off the bat as we try to bring semiconductor manufacturing back. The first new TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor plant coming online in Arizona, according to TSMC, is already achieving higher yields than TSMC achieves at its state-of-the-art factories in Taiwan. We saw in the 1980s when everyone said, "Oh, we're getting our butts handed to us by the Japanese automakers," the Reagan administration negotiated a quota. They just capped how many Japanese cars could come in. The Japanese automakers had to come invest in the U.S. And within a few years, the Japanese cars produced in the US were perfectly competitive with imports. In fact, the Toyota Camry had more American content than any other car on the road for most of the last couple of decades. And so, look, there are absolutely going to be costs to climbing back out of this hole we have dug for ourselves. But the idea that, things would be so much more expensive in the United States if we had nurtured and fostered a productive domestic manufacturing industry instead of giving that away, I don't think is at all supported either by economic theory or by the experience where we actually sort of do have case studies to the contrary. In terms of what we do about it from here, I think your point is very well taken and correct that, especially given that there are going to be significant transition costs here, it's important to try to do this in a way that minimizes them. And so, for instance, I think, establishing policies that are for the long term, that have predictability, that phase in gradually, are very important. And so, one policy that we focus on at American Compass, on one hand is sort of very just big and broad and blunt, which is we should have a global tariff. We should essentially say anything coming into this country has a 10% tariff attached to it. And what that does is, at the margin, makes imports less attractive than domestic production and consumption. Or if you look at it another way, if you think about that exchange...
And just to interrupt you to understand what it is you're arguing for, when you say global 10% tariff, that means a tariff on Mexico and Canada as well. It means getting out of existing free trade agreements that constrain the ability of the United States to impose such tariffs.
Yes, that's right. Now, I also think you ideally want to define that tariff as one that can go up or down over time, tied to that thing that you're focused on, which is the trade deficit. I think you want to say predictably over time, that's going to keep rising if it needs to correct the trade deficit. Conversely, that can come back down if the trade deficit is in fact fading away as we start to do more of this stuff ourselves. But again, that's not something you want to just sort of announce overnight. That's something you ideally put in legislation so that it's much harder to change. And you say, this is going to start on this date a year from now and increase at this rate. And this is how it is going to be set over time. Because what you're trying to do isn't just sort of, throw everything up in the air. You're trying to create the new conditions and incentives under which investment will flow differently. That's sort of the short to medium term action. I just to speak briefly to when you ask about Canada and Mexico as an example, I do think there's also an important point here about the long term, which is that there are plenty of places where our trading relationships actually can work quite well. Where the U.S. is engaged in free trade, essentially with other market democracies, particularly that also have not just similar labor environmental standards, but also similar standards of living and so forth. Ideally, you would have quite free trade with them, and it would operate much more, as the classic models said, and to the benefit of everybody. But essentially, to get from here to there, I think what we need to be able to do is say, look, the current baseline of free trade, no matter what, goes away. We are replacing that with a default where there are, in fact, going to be tariffs. And then let's figure out who wants to be essentially inside a U.S.-centered trading bloc. And part of being in that bloc is you have to play by the rules that we're going to define. But if you're in that bloc, then certainly there's no need to have those tariffs on you. But you're going to need to maintain also a consistent policy that says the countries outside the bloc are outside the bloc, that China can't just cheaply import things into Canada instead and then get them into the U.S. that way, that you're basically going to have the onside team and the offside team.
So clearly some of these ideas have been very influential in parts of the Republican Party that are actually trying to transform it into this multiracial working class coalition. Some of the people who've been influenced by this set of ideas include folks like Tom Cotton and like J.D. Vance, who's now the vice president. And clearly the most radical break that the current Trump administration is making with long-standing Republican Party policy, and there's a number of areas where there's quite radical breaks, but perhaps the most obvious and a notable one is on tariffs. So in the first weeks of his administration, Trump has imposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, threatened to impose tariffs on many other countries. As we're recording, it's unclear what the fate of these tariffs is. Quite quickly, Trump seems to have come to temporary agreements with Canada and Mexico to suspend those tariffs in return for undertakings that they will do more to secure the respective borders with the United States. We'll see to what extent he's simply thinking of tariffs as a bargaining chip to gain all kinds of concessions from American allies, and to what extent he actually wants to impose more lasting tariffs. This is probably going to be the case with his announcements regarding tariffs on China. How are you thinking about this? Do you think that the Trump administration is in fact moving American policy closer to the kind of endpoint you want to get to? Are there elements of what they have been doing so far and how they're rolling this out that you're concerned about? Should we see the benefits of these policies in ways that when you're reading the New York Times and The Economist would not be evident? Or do you share the concerns that not just those newspapers and magazines, but also many economists like Larry Summers have expressed about the changes we're seeing?
Well, I think the distinction that you made between the sort of tariff as a bargaining chip versus as really an economic policy is really the most important one. We see this with all sorts of policies. You can think about this with taxes as well. We have taxes that are designed to raise revenue and fund the government. And we want those to be as sort of, broad and simple and predictable and efficient as possible. We also have taxes that we use when there are specific things we're trying to discourage. And it would be a huge mistake to try to sort of analyze those in the same light. They are doing very different things. I think likewise, tariffs, as we've just been talking about them for a few minutes now, as an economic tool, can have very important effects in shaping global trade and shaping patterns of investment. But that's very different from using them as a bargaining chip or as a way to gain negotiating leverage. And I think what you've seen with what Trump has done out of the gate on, certainly with respect to Canada and Mexico, is tariffs as a negotiating tool. And so I think it's a huge mistake to analyze them as a matter of economics and say, is this good economic policy? Because it's not supposed to be economic policy, right? If we think no one would look at some military conflict that we might choose to engage in and say, well, wait a minute, is that good for economic growth, or what's that going to do to prices? You would accept that there are economic growth and price effects that aren't good associated with pursuing some other goal. And so, I think there's a very fair question of okay, so what is the actual negotiating goal when it comes to a Mexico or a Canada? I think the case with Mexico is a lot clearer. And even in the sort of, as this has been playing out in real time, the sorts of concessions you saw from Mexico seemed a lot more substantial. I think on the flip side, then there's a question of, okay, what do you gain or what do you harm by using tariffs in this way? Because one of the really interesting things about U.S. policy, really in the post-Cold War, well, even in the post-World War II era, certainly in the post-Cold War era, there was an attitude that sort of economic tools of statecraft should be taken off the table. That because we were committed to free trade, because we had this overwhelming focus on free markets, market efficiency, believing that we were building this sort of liberal world order, we were not going to use the economic power that we have. I mean, it's actually funny. We were sort of more willing to go launch an actual war and fire missiles at somebody than we would be to launch a trade war and fire an economic cost at somebody. One could read and write many books about the the ideological implications of that. But clearly what Trump and his team are saying is something very different, that actually these economic tools are entirely legitimate and quite powerful tools of statecraft. And I absolutely agree with that. Whether we are using them well in a given case then has to be evaluated on the merits of that case. But I think what I would say, taking, for instance, what someone like Larry Summers has said about it, is I think Larry is absolutely wrong at the strategic level to say, whoa, you can't do this. You're going to break the global trading system. The global trading system is badly broken, and we should be willing to use these tools. At the tactical level, looking at what we're doing in any particular case, I think it's entirely reasonable to say, okay, what are we actually trying to gain out of this? Who are we helping versus hurting? Is this strengthening versus harming alliances? And that's where I certainly think there is room for improvement, as they say, in sort of how the Trump administration is proceeding with it.
What about the political costs of this? So, one of the things that Larry Summers was absolutely right about in 2021, 2022, when he got a lot of incoming for that from the Democratic side, was to warn about the potentially inflationary impact of the not aptly named Inflation Reduction Act and other measures that the Biden administration was taking. And clearly, that bout inflation proved to be incredibly costly to Democrats. And we saw across the board that incumbents have been struggling for the last year or two, in part because of a post-pandemic inflation that proved to be incredibly unpopular. Now, surely when you put up tariffs, you may be right that in the long run, perhaps that is good for economic growth, that it certainly is good for, on your account, the incomes of ordinary people and so on. But surely in the short run, there is a serious price to pay in terms of inflation. Do voters just hate inflation so much that this is a suicidal policy? I'm not talking about the merits of it, but just the electoral viability of it. Or do you think that you can sell tariffs as a form of investment in the future and perhaps as a form of patriotic policy that can withstand what appear to be pretty strong headwinds?
Well, I guess there are a few things to say about this. One is I think there are good and bad ways to do it. And just to briefly touch on what I mentioned with the sort of second inward focused dimension of all of this, any effective policy, I think, to impose tariffs and try to reshore domestic manufacturing, to reindustrialize the economy, has to be paired with domestic industrial policy that makes that possible and effective. And so, one of the advantages of having predictable phased-in tariffs is that you can pair that with predictable investment commitments to actually build up domestic capacity. And I think one thing we should want to see and can see is that, among other things, by using the revenue that we get from the tariffs to reduce other costs, to encourage investment, you can sort of be doing these things in parallel so that it's not just a strategy of, well, we're going to shock the system and come out the other side. It's a strategy of we are going to sort of facilitate a transition from one model to another.
Just to say, here you're sounding oddly like the defenders of NAFTA and the free traders of the late 90s and early 2000s, who were saying, yes, of course, part of having free trade is that there's going to be some losers, right? Some people whose factories get outsourced and so on. But that's fine. We're simply going to invest the gains that we make from this free trade to make sure that we compensate them. But of course, politics being what it is, and human fallibility being what it is, by and large, these people did not get compensated, which had all kinds of negative social, cultural, and perhaps political consequences. And so now you're saying, well, look, of course, there's going to be short-term inflation, but we can simply use the gains from this policy in order to make sure that we compensate those who would have to pay higher prices for milk and bread and so on as a result of these policies. And that's going to fix that problem. Perhaps in theory that is doable, but is that actually going to happen? And is somebody going to be able to carry out that policy in a way that actually buffers those political headwinds?
Well, I guess I would say it's a little different because the theory of NAFTA and of the free traders was, well, there were two theories. One, a theory of NAFTA was somehow, well, we're going to, make less of some things and more of other things, and, we'll have free trade and comparative advantage and all that. We've talked about that already. The other piece that I think you were just describing, and sort of, yes, there will be winners and losers, but the winners can compensate the losers. It's very important to say that we actually did that. And this goes back to really where we started our conversation, which is that, through taxation and redistribution, we have in fact raised the material living standards of people across the socioeconomic spectrum. The problem was that that's just a terrible model of political economy. The idea that, well, a bunch of people are going to lose their jobs and we're going to hollow out the manufacturing economy and all of these communities are going to collapse, but we can mail them a bigger check, again, is what we did and was an incredibly stupid way to try to build a strong economy and a healthy nation and political community. What I'm describing here is something very different, which is what we are actually thinking about. Again, yes, there are sort of trade-offs and transitions to think about, but if we actually get the end goal right, which is that we want to build a stronger industrial base and create more good jobs in the country, if we have the right actual goal, and then I don't think it's sort of comparable at all. The second piece then that I think is really important to say when we talk about the inflationary side of it is that the kind of price effects you might see from tariffs are not of the same magnitude of what we saw in the Biden administration. And it's actually very funny to go back and look at sort of past tariff debates and notice run around screaming that these are inflationary is a post-Biden inflation phenomenon. It is a closest tool at hand for economists who just don't like tariffs. And in fact, if you press them on it hard enough, they'll admit that tariffs aren't actually inflationary. There are relative price effects. But if the best
so
way
explain to me why not, right? Because
the best way to right.
Let me just lay out why there might be, and then you can respond to that, right? The simple argument for why they are is that they're a kind of form of tax, right? Today I pay $10 for my cheap pair of shoes, and let's say $15,000 for a relatively cheap electric vehicle from China. You're coming in, you're going to say, well, they can't just import that without paying anything. We're going to put 10% tariff on this. Presumably manufacturers are at least going to try to pass on those tariffs. There might be a debate about just what percentage of it they pass on, but for simplicity's sake, let's say that they pass on that price effect fully. And now my pair of shoes costs $11, and my car now costs $16,500. And obviously, inflation is just what you pay for goods. So if that's gone up by 10%, then that's inflationary. It's perhaps not 10% inflation because obviously not all goods are produced in China and some goods are produced domestically. But that's a clear inflationary effect. All right, that's a very simple model. Now give me your response for why that's not how the world works.
Right. So as you said, as you're just trying to describe that, you said, essentially a tariff is a type of tax. Have you ever heard anyone else argue against another tax on the grounds that it's inflationary?
Some, but I get your point. Go ahead.
Yeah, the fascinating thing and sort of the thought exercise to run through is, imagine you went up to your economist or policymaker friend and you said, hey, I'm really concerned about this budget deficit we have, $2 trillion a year. I feel like we probably do need to raise taxes a little bit. What do you think? Is that inflationary or deflationary? No one is going to say it's inflationary. Most people would actually say it is probably deflationary, or at least a reduction in the inflation rate, insofar as it's going to remove the amount of borrowing and spending the government is doing. Maybe they'll say, oh, what kind of tax is it? You say, well, I was actually thinking we should probably do a VAT. A value-added tax. And then your economist friends can get very excited. That's terrific. A VAT is the most efficient, ideal revenue base. This is exactly what we need to be doing in this country. It's probably, my model says it's going to be good for growth and all sorts of wonderful things. And then you say, oh, great.
And that, for people who may not know exactly what it is, it's only one form of it, but sales tax is
Yes.
a form of that. Right?
And then you say, great, I'm really glad we're moving this direction together. Just one other caveat, we're only going to do it on imported products. And then they say, whoa, wait a minute, never mind. I take back everything I just said. Now I notice you're proposing a tariff. I now declare it to be insane, terrible, and inflationary. And what you realize is that, no, actually, these are just arguments being thrown at tariffs. Is there a price effect on some goods when you essentially impose a form of tax on those goods? Absolutely. But the things to understand about it, first of all, is that those are mediated by an enormous number of other forces. So how much of it lands on the producer versus the consumer? It's certainly not true that the producer pays all of it. But in any economic model where you're thinking about the incidence of the tax, you would assume that it falls depending on elasticities and so forth. Some on each side. Again, it's only when it comes to tariffs that economists decide to throw all of that out the window and just score political points. Another thing you see is that it's absorbed at different points in the supply chain. So one really interesting thing seen with a lot of the China tariffs that the Trump administration did impose in the first Trump term is that you could see that essentially the importers into the U.S., the wholesalers and the retailers, were paying higher prices for those goods, but that it wasn't really showing up in a lot of cases in the retail prices that consumers paid. And so there's an instance where maybe you're talking about lower profit margins for others. That has its own set of costs and benefits, but isn't necessarily inflationary. And then you also see situations where, in essence, because of how this stuff is being phased in over time, how supply chains adjust and so forth, you don't actually tend to see what consumers are paying going up much at all. Then you also have places where consumers do pay more. But when you're asking what the scale of that is, you have to remember that only about 15% of American consumption is imported. And so even if you put a 10% tax on it immediately day one and consumers have to pay all of it, that's only, that's 1.5%. If you're phasing that in even over a couple of years, if it's not even all being paid by consumers, you're talking about less than 1%. If you do now have all of that tax revenue and you're using it either to reduce some of those costs, you're using it for other tax cuts, etc., that comes down even more. And so what you realize is that you're actually essentially talking about actions within the margin of error of what we experience in inflation rates every year anyway. And importantly, they are one-time level change effects. So a 10% tariff isn't another 1.5% inflation every year. It is a total change over the entire life of the policy of that amount. So again, you're talking about certainly order magnitude less than what we saw with Biden. And then I do think the last point that I'm glad you highlighted was the sort of case in favor, which is you're actually getting something for this. I think a huge problem with what happened during the Biden administration was we were told it wouldn't happen. It was essentially an enormous amount of government spending out the door. And Americans looked at it and said, well, okay, what did we actually get here? We were told this wouldn't happen, and it did. I think saying that, much smaller price effects that are essentially broadcast in effect as being for a particular purpose that people are overwhelmingly supportive of is an entirely different political equation. And I think you see that in how Trump and the administration are already thinking and talking about it.
So just to push you one more time on this, let's distinguish between two forms of inflation, one of which is much more worrying from a macroeconomic perspective than the other, right? So the first is if there's just profligate spending from the government, or there's various forms of handouts, or the central bank isn't independent in ways that leads to them making a ton of money available just in order to make sure that the government gets reelected by inducing an artificial boom. This is the kind of policies that can create ongoing or runaway inflation. And they're particularly dangerous from a macroeconomic perspective because you can end up in the world that Argentina has been on for much of the 20th and 21st century. Really, really harmful to prosperity in the long run. Now, both VATs and tariffs aren't inflationary in that kind of way because, as you're pointing out, they're kind of one-time level changes, right? If VAT goes up from 15 to 20%, that does mean that there is a significant increase in the price of the goods that you're buying at any one time, but it doesn't tend to induce long-term inflation because it isn't one of those mechanisms that can sort of perpetuate itself. It's a one-time level change. But then there's a second kind of inflation that might be more, perhaps less worrying in a macroeconomic way, but worrying in a political way, which is one that even a one-time level change still means that people can buy less, right? So there's some reason to worry about it. We think that being able to buy stuff is good, when even a one-time level change means that people can buy less than they could earlier, and that's a reduction in human well-being. But more importantly, in a 4-year political cycle, or in a 2-year political cycle, as you have in the United States when you think of the House of Representatives and parts of the Senate, a one-time level change can really matter, right? And on economic theory, I believe that VAT is a kind of tax that is expected to have a one-time inflationary level change, right? It's not leading to long-term inflation of the Argentinian kind that we have reason to be really concerned about, but it is leading to a one-time level change, and that might be really economically harmful. So if the Trump administration really does go forward, and let's say that it imposes a very significant tax on China and imposes some tax on perhaps Mexico and Canada, it follows your kind of example. Even if all of the kind of macroeconomic benefits you're talking about follow, wouldn't there still be a risk of an increase in short-term inflation that might cost it the next election?
I think that's certainly a risk. I think the example from the first Trump term is really important to look at here. I mean, the tariffs that Trump put on China in 2018 were enormous. Those were 25% for the most part out of the gate. And it's important to notice both that there was very little inflation that actually showed up in the data, and that where there were places that a consumer price rose significantly, I'm very hard pressed to remember any sort of political fallout or political cost associated with it. And so, yes, I think there are risks there. I think it's this sort of funny situation where, in effect, you have Trump and his team actually contemplating and potentially doing exactly the thing that all of the good government democracy defenders have been pleading for so long, which is to not simply think about how to sell everybody out to win the next election, but to actually pursue the policy with the long-term gains. And so I guess it seems to me you're somewhat asking a descriptive rather than normative question, in that normatively, I think, yes, this is exactly what we should do. Descriptively, are they going to do it? Evidence from the first term is yes, they will. Evidence from even the past couple of weeks is yes, they will. One thing that's very interesting about this initial round of sort of threatened tariffs and how it has ended up playing out quite well, I would say, is that the threatened tariffs on Canada and Mexico, at least at this point, are not going into effect. The threatened tariffs on China are going into effect. There is now an extra 10% tariff on everything from China, in addition to which we've eliminated the de minimis exception, which is a sort of weird, wonky issue, but essentially it's that we don't subject small value imports and packages to tariffs. Well, we brought that small value up to $800, which is how everything, you're buying from Shein and Temu and so forth, was coming in tariff free. The Trump administration is just...
And part of the problem here is that the idea behind the de minimis exception was if there's some person buying a bunch of things in China and bringing them into the country, or there's sort of minimal forms of trade, it really isn't worth the hassle of enforcing tariffs on
Correct.
it, and that seems sensible. But nowadays you have those manufacturers that ship directly from China, who are actually giant corporations with hundreds of millions, probably possibly billions of dollars in sales to the United States. And so what was meant to sort of only apply to very small-time economic activity now applies to a huge range of clothing and other kinds of goods pursued by giant companies.
Correct. Yeah, thank you. Yes, that is a helpful summary. And so now not only do you have higher tariffs on everything from China, you now have every consumer who loves buying stuff from Shein and Temu seeing an even bigger effect on top of that. And they've gone ahead and done it. So I think it would be cool if the political science crew took at least a minute to acknowledge that the Trump administration does in fact seem to be sort of living by the courage of its convictions on this stuff and doing things that may well have short-term political costs, but that are consistent with the broader commitments that they've made and certainly have the potential and in my view will have significant long-term benefits.
So I've been pushing on tariffs for good reason, because I think both it's one of the interesting parts of this conversation and the most topical ones. But I want to make sure that we get to hear and air and assess the other elements of what you think the sort of broader-based change to economic policy should be. So beyond tariffs, what do you think an economic policy more interested in revitalizing the American working class would look like?
Well, so I've touched briefly on the industrial policy side of it, and just the idea that at the end of the day, we have to recognize that the forms of investments that are going to be most economically attractive to investors, that are going to deliver them the highest profits, are not necessarily, there's no correlation there with the ones that will actually be good for the American economy, produce good jobs for American workers. And so the basic idea of industrial policy is just to say we need to put a thumb on the scale for the kinds of investments, again, often in the industrial economy, that we think actually are going to be particularly valuable. So that's another kind of macro element. The other thing I'd really emphasize, broadly, and then I'll highlight a couple of concrete examples of it, is just the idea that, workers matter. And that the point of the economy is not just to deliver the cheapest possible good to the consumer, but in fact to have a good job at a high wage for the worker. And maybe that sounds like common sense once you say it that way. It's really important to underscore that is essentially a heresy, and that particularly on the right of center, the view has been that labor is just kind of an input, like electricity or lumber or whatever. And the cheaper and more plentiful it is, the better. And so that has driven, again, until recently, an immigration policy that said, well, if firms say they have a labor shortage, then bring in more workers. You certainly don't want workers to have any power to demand higher wages or better conditions. And instead, we're just going to do whatever is best for the businesses and trust that somehow that's going to make its way to everybody. And so I think there's a rapidly growing recognition on the right of center, and certainly it's a huge focus of our work. First of all, just empirically that has not worked out. Second of all, conceptually, there's no reason to believe it will. There's nothing in economic theory that says just companies maximizing their profits are going to create good jobs. And then that thirdly, that this is a real problem, that obviously, cheap stuff for consumers, as you said, is a good thing. We want people to be able to buy as much as possible, but that can't be the only thing we're optimizing for. And so in practice, you see this playing out across a number of policy areas. You see it on the immigration front, where obviously there are a lot of reasons that there's a heavy focus on illegal immigration. But more broadly, there is skepticism increasingly about low skill immigration, about temporary worker programs. We saw the flare up over H-1Bs and the question of why should we want tech companies to sort of just be able to bring in as many entry level workers as they want. I think we see it a lot on education policy, where there's much more focus now on workforce training and the recognition that actually, not just saying, hey, let's try to get everybody into college, and if they don't get into college, oh well, but that there is an important public role to be played, probably in partnership with the private sector, in actually investing in the kinds of skills and productivity that workers have. And then finally, you see it directly on labor policy. And I think one of the most exciting shifts on the right of center is toward taking organized labor seriously. And, there's plenty of dysfunction in the way labor operates in the country now. But the idea of labor, of organizing, of wanting workers to have power is something I think you increasingly see conservatives embracing. And it is one of, I think, the most important things we can focus on, so that we get into a situation, again, in the industrial policy context, I said, what policy can we have so that the actual most productive investments are the ones people will pursue. I think we likewise want to be in a situation where building businesses that create good jobs for workers are the ones you feel like you have to pursue. And so actually ensuring that workers have some power in the economy is an important piece of that.
Why is it that you think this should be something that right of center people pursue, or to put the point the other way around? Why is it that listeners to this podcast who may be sympathetic to your concern for the living conditions and standards of working people, who may be critical of globalization in various ways, who may be very sympathetic to labor unions, should trust the right, and particularly the American right, to actually pursue these policies? Or to put the point of a little bit in a slightly more pointed way, to put this concern in a slightly more pointed way, one argument I hear commonly is to say, look, there is an interesting shift going on in the Republican Party. It is remarkable that Donald Trump has indeed been able to win not just a clear majority of white working class voters, but a rapidly growing share of non-white working class voters in this election, that he evidently has struck a chord with Latino, to a lesser but real extent Asian American and African American working class voters. But once it comes to government, he tends to sell them out. When you look at the big tax policies of his first administration, they consisted in big handouts to the largest corporations. And if you want to be sympathetic, you might say, well, it's really hard to go against your traditional coalition. I think some Democratic leaders have recognized that certain forms of identity politics in which they've engaged for the last 10 years may be harmful to the party brand. But when your donors are insistent on those policies and your young staffers are very committed to them, and there's a set of groups and activist organizations who are pushing for them, best of luck managing to actually say no to them. And shouldn't we expect the same of the Republican Party, even if there's interesting think tanks like yours, influential voices like yours, trying to lay out a kind of coherent vision for a Republican policy that takes these issues seriously, and that would be the natural basis for broadening its inroads among the non-white working class. Even if some people like J.D. Vance are bought into those ideas, when it comes time to write a budget, isn't there also going to be tremendous pressure from some of the billionaires who have Donald Trump's ear? And in the end, isn't the Club for Growth and other elements of the Republican coalition going to prevail in saying what we really need to do is to cut the taxes of big corporations and make sure that they're able to do business as freely as they want? Is this policy change really going to happen on the Republican side?
I think there's a sort of substantive answer to that and a political answer to it. The substantive answer is to recognize that, conservatives really do care about these things. And to the extent that it was all thrown out the window, especially in the Reagan coalition. And frankly, Reagan was a lot better on this stuff in the sort of post-Reagan interpretation of Reagan. That was a function of this very narrow kind of libertarian set of actors and interest groups, Club for Growth, Americans for Tax Reform, and so forth, that, yes, absolutely have been very influential, but have always been a very small segment of the coalition to whom an awful lot of thinking was outsourced. And what I think you're seeing happen in really over the last decade and really accelerating now is conservatives really sort of breaking up with libertarians on a lot of these issues. That, in an era where markets really were delivering for a lot of the things conservatives cared about in terms of supporting families and community, strong nation, and so forth, it was a coherent coalition. To the extent that the free market ideology is now sort of ripping at the foundations of families and communities in the nation, conservatives are saying, well, then we're not into that anymore. And so I think it is important to kind of take at face value that if you actually go back to what, most conservatives at the local level, whether you're in the think tank discussions in DC or just at the, on the golf course in some town somewhere, people really do care more about the ability of somebody to get a job and raise a family than they do about the carried interest loophole. And so I think especially as you see a realignment underway in which, as you said, a lot of these voters are moving into the Republican coalition, it becomes not only sort of intellectually, but also just self-interestedly much more important to focus on those concerns quite seriously. And so when you take those sort of substantive and political elements together, I think you're able to make sense of these changes you're seeing. The two caveats are, first of all, Donald Trump is, I think, himself very much a transitional figure in all of this. Especially in his first term, he gets to office. There is no infrastructure or thinking around any of these topics. There is no set of policy white papers on the shelf. There's Paul Ryan sitting at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue with his big corporate tax cut and his Obamacare repeal, and that's where things went. But, I think that if you look, first of all, at who Trump is appointing in his second term, at virtually every single position, the person holding it this time is far more in this direction that we're talking about here than the first term person. And if you look past Trump at who is the Republican leadership coming up, who are the conservative leaders, not only in the Republican Party, but in think tanks, at, writing journals, in law, et cetera, all of them are thinking much more this way as well. And so I think that's a very encouraging sign. The second caveat is that, yes, of course, this will always be imperfect. You will always have billionaires with very different interests. That is a obvious feature of both the Republican and the Democratic parties at this point. And so, no, we're not headed to some, wonderful utopian situation where our politics flawlessly delivers for the interests of working people in all cases. But I am encouraged by the direction. And if I had to bet on who's going to do a better job on that, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party going forward, I certainly see a lot more reasons to be optimistic, at least, about the trajectory on the right.
And perhaps as a last question, explain to me why that is. We haven't really talked about the Democrats so far. And there's a kind of slightly paradoxical situation in which the traditional policy of a Republican Party is one that in certain ways prioritizes the interests of business, that is embraced by chambers of commerce across the country and so on. But increasingly, the voter base of a Republican Party doesn't reflect that. Whereas 25 years ago, the member of a country club almost certainly voted for the Republican Party, and the member of a union household most likely voted for the Democratic Party. Today that has shifted, and so Republican Party policy is in some ways a lagging indicator, trying to sort of catch up with where many of the party's voters now are. Now, when you look at the Democratic Party, it was traditionally the party of the working class. It was traditionally the party of the unions and so on. But its electorate now tends to be, concentrated in the most affluent parts of the country, in people with high levels of education, and increasingly in people, who are in the business world, who are those members of country clubs, even if those are perhaps a little traditional. And so I guess the question for Democrats is, should they embrace that? Should they see that, they're also lagging in the way the Republican Party is, and the Democrats and Republicans will simply switch sides? Or do Democrats need to go back towards doubling down on policies that will actually serve the working class, even if it doesn't feel like that is what the electoral coalition is evolving to be at this point? What would be your advice to Democrats, and are you hoping for a kind of bipartisan consensus on some of these issues? Is that something that's realistic, or do you think American politics will simply polarize over those issues, as in some ways it was in the post-war period or other moments of American history, perhaps in the early 20th century, just with the signs of the political parties reversed from what it was previously?
Well, I think you make a very good point that gets overlooked a lot in these discussions of political realignment, where everyone's focused on this, the working class shifting to the right of center. It is as important to recognize what that means for the left of center, partly in terms of who's leaving, partly in terms of who's entering. There are an awful lot of those upper middle class Republicans who are now increasingly the core base of the Democratic Party. Certainly, if you receive the invitations to all of the DC gatherings they're trying to put on, and I think that is pushing the Democratic Party in exactly the wrong direction. As much as these forces are helping the Republican Party to focus more where I'd like everybody to focus, they're leaving the Democratic Party focusing more and more in the wrong direction in a lot of cases, and really becoming ever more concentrated on a set of progressive social issues that are neither popular nor responsive to most people's real concerns. And so, my personal kind of theory of the case or theory of change is that there's sort of a two-step process here. One is, I think we are going to see continued drifts that lead to a real kind of political crisis for the left of center. People forget we are in this very anachronistic age since 2000, where you're supposed to turn on the TV on election night not knowing who's going to win. There is as much a tradition in the last 50 to 100 years of 20 percentage point wins and 450, 500 electoral votes. And certainly if you kind of take the direction the parties are headed right now and imagine what a 2028, 2032 post-Trump Republican Party and whatever the Democratic Party is headed toward, I think we're headed in that direction. Obviously, an awful lot can change on all those fronts, but that does seem to me where a lot of trends point. But I think there's a second step, which is important and healthy, which is that I think the Democratic Party will respond to that. I think it takes political defeat and crisis to lead to a rethinking. And exactly to the point that you raised, the goal here should be a new consensus. It's funny, that is the American Compass mission literally starts that way, to restore an economic consensus that, and then into all of these things that we've been talking about. Because I think you're always going to have partisan contestation on all sorts of details, partly just for political reasons, partly because people are going to have different views and priorities and about all sorts of things. but we typically do operate in the context of a broader consensus about what markets are for, what public policy is for, what we're trying to achieve. And it seems to me that for a very long time, the US was blessed to have an exceptionally good one that shaped our politics in a very healthy way, that built the extraordinary middle class. And roughly in the 1980s and into the 1990s, we shifted first with this sort of Reaganomics market fundamentalism that the Democrats then decided they needed to copy, right? Bill Clinton, New Democrats were in essence saying, well, we're getting killed by Reaganism, so let's be more like Reagan, and sent us down this 30-year path that, typically goes by the name neoliberalism, that again delivered on what people said they wanted to achieve, which was globalization, cheap consumer stuff, rising material living standards, and complete failure to account for what we used to focus on and what really matters. And I would love to see a return to a consensus that focuses on those things. And then two political parties that from that starting point have no shortage of things to fight on, but realize that they have to get that right if they're going to be successful.
Oren Cass, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, this was fantastic. Thank you for having me.